So now let's take a look at cell respiration, right? So now we know that plants and other things that photosynthesize, they will make glucose, right? And in that process, they make a little bit of ATP, and they'll use that to drive some of the processes for metabolism. But in the end, what do they do with that glucose? Well, as long as it's sunny outside, plants can make a pretty large amount of glucose, but the plants don't always need all of that directly converted into energy right then and there on the spot. Plants don't really move around all that much, so they're not going to expend energy in ways that we think about. They'll use it to grow. They'll use it to go through the reproductive process and produce seeds or spores or sperm or pollen, whatever they need to produce. So they don't always use it right then and there. So a lot of it's going to be stored. Glucose can actually be, as we saw earlier in talking about the macromolecules, when we looked at carbohydrates, it can be transformed into storage material like starch, or it can be changed into building material like cellulose, which is what condensed cellulose is what wood is. But when they store it, how do they get the energy back out of it when they need it? Maybe during the nighttime, maybe during a couple of cloudy days where they're not really able to photosynthesize. There has to be a process to get this back out. And if we think about it, when we can't photosynthesize, so animals, autotrophs can't photosynthesize, heterotrophs can't photosynthesize. So when we eat plants, or we eat things that ate plants, how do we break down that glucose that's in there and get that back out? Well, the answer is cell respiration. Plants do this too. They have to break down the glucose as well. So this process applies to both plants and animals. And so there's an overall equation for this. Now, most of us know that all this equation is going to be a photosynthesis written backwards. So we're going to start with the glucose. Now, for the most part, for cell respiration, we've got to have oxygen, okay? Because we know we take that in, that's the gas that we need. So we eat something, right? We get nourishment in our bodies, and we get sugar in there, right? And then inside of our mitochondria, or for cell respiration near our mitochondria, we have to actually break that back down. We need oxygen in order for this process, the bigger part of this process, to happen. And at the end of it, there are three things that we're going to get. One of them is going to be energy, ATP. The other is going to be what we exhale in the form of a gas, and that's going to be CO2. The other thing is water. Water is a byproduct that is made. When we take a look at this, we're going to see why that is. But if you ever forget a cell respiration equation, just think of it like this. You eat things, that's sugar. You breathe, that's going to be the O2. And then if you put your hand in front of your mouth and exhale, you'll feel the other three things. Okay, I felt a gas coming out, right? The air coming out. That's CO2. Then I actually feel like there's a little bit of moisture on my hand. So that's the water, right? And then also, it was warm. That's the energy. And in our bodies, energy takes the form of ATP. So those are the three things to come out. In the equation, we don't really include ATP. We just say glucose, oxygen, and the presence of the mitochondria will give us carbon dioxide and water. This also has to be balanced, and it's balanced the same way as before. 1 glucose, 6 of everything else. So let's start off. We're going to be in the first process we're going to look at is going to happen in the cytoplasm. But also, this organelle is the mitochondria, and everybody remembers the mighty mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, right? So we're going to start off with glucose coming into the system. And this is the same glucose that plants made, so it's charged with the energy from the sun, and it goes through a process called glycolysis. Glycolysis. Lysis means to split, cut, pop. Glyco is referring to the glucose molecule. Glucose is too big to fit into the mitochondria. It needs to be broken down. I mean, it's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. We're going to split that in half essentially through the process of glycolysis, and we end up with a molecule called a pyruvate. Now, glucose has 6 carbons. Half of that would be 3 carbons. So a pyruvate has 3 carbons, and we'd get 2 of those, right? 6 cut in half is 3 and 3. You got 2 pyruvates. In that process, we get 2 major things other than the pyruvate. We're going to get another carrier molecule called NADH. Now, before we had NADPH, remember that the P actually stands for phosphate, but if you think of it like this, NADPH is found in photosynthesis, so NADPH, P for photosynthesis. NADH is in cell respiration. So we get two more carrier molecules, and again, they're going to be carrying hydrogens that are taken off the glucose that are going to be that are charged with the energy from the sun. And in this process, we also get a little bit of energy. We get a little bit of ATP, just two ATP molecules, right? So ATPs can be used by the rest of the stuff in the cell. NADH actually can go into the mitochondria, just like the pyruvate can go into the mitochondria. There's a cycle that occurs next to the pyruvate called the acetyl-CoA cycle. Now, it is kind of important. I don't really go into much detail in the level that for Biology 1, but just know that something is produced from this. And the major thing is going to be two more NADHs, so two more carrier molecules carrying hydrogens. And what's important about those hydrogens? They have the energy from the sun locked up in their electron. Other things occur here, but for the most part, it's a kind of a big process. I don't go into much detail with it, but no, the acetyl-CoA cycle occurs first, and it kind of breaks down pyruvate into a much simpler molecule that can go into the next cycle. The next cycle is called the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. You could use either for it. I simply call it the CAC, citric acid cycle, but other notebooks and information you may find may change that. But there are, again, some products that are made here. First of all, you're going to get a lot of NADHs, a lot of electrons being stripped down, because this is where that glucose and the pyruvates are finally broken down and all of the hydrogens are released off of it. So you're going to get 6 more NADHs, right? So that's a lot. And then you're going to get 2 new carrier molecules called FADH2s. FADH2s, we get 2 of those. They're a larger molecule. They can actually carry 2 hydrogens, whereas NAD can only carry 1 hydrogen. So we get 2 FADH2s. That's a lot of stuff that's being produced. That's all going into the mitochondria, and it's got a process that all of that's going to be taken to here in just a little bit. But the idea is that we're freeing up and we're removing all those hydrogens off that glucose in these processes, and again, those hydrogens carry the energy from the sun, and that's what we need. We need to utilize, isolate and utilize that energy. The first couple of steps are just freeing it up. But in the citric acid cycle, we also produce a little bit of energy, 2 ATP, so that can be used by the cell process. But there's another thing in our equation that we need to account for, and that's going to be the production of CO2, the gas that we exhale. Most of the gas, the CO2 that we exhale, actually comes from the citric acid cycle, but some actually does come from the acetyl-CoA cycle, as we'll see in the notes later. But just know, the citric acid cycle is where most of it comes from, and that is what we're going to exhale. So that's something else in our equation we've been able to account for. So the last thing is, we haven't made water yet, and we haven't produced any vast amounts of energy. A few here and a few there, yeah, but not a lot. So we're going to sum up all these things that are coming in, right? So if you add the 2 NADHs and 2 NADHs and 6 NADHs, that's going to be 10 NADHs. And then our 2 FADH2s. They're going to go down to the last process, and they're going to simply do what they've been doing. You know, their final product they've been doing this whole time is carrying these hydrogens around, so they're going to deliver these hydrogens. And by extent, the electrons that are charged with the photons from the sun. These charged electrons go down a chain reaction called the ETC, the electron transport chain, also called the electron transfer chain. And it's kind of like a what's that game, Mousetrap, or like a dominoes effect where you push one at top and it goes down, or like a slinky going downhill. As the electrons that have this energy in it go down this chain reaction, they lose their energy, right? So you can see that on the diagram. The energy behind it kind of fades away as it goes down. And where is this energy going? Well, it's being put into the production of vast amounts of ATP, so 34 ATP. And that ETC, the electron transfer chain, that's where we get the majority of a vast majority of our energy. Now, if you added all this up, 2 plus 2 and 34, that's going to be 38 ATP. That's not a finite number. Everybody's physiology is different, and different organisms have a slightly different number. For us, for humans, it's anywhere between 32 and 40, essentially, ATP per glucose molecule. So there's a couple of loose ends on here. What's the only thing we haven't accounted for yet? We've produced our ATP, we've got our carbon dioxide, we took in our glucose, and we took in, we haven't taken in something yet, right? We haven't brought in oxygen, and we haven't produced water. Turns out those electrons at the end of the ETC, what happens to them? you can't just have a buildup of electrons. That's building up electricity. That's shocking, right? You'll kill the mitochondria. You don't want to do that. You could damage the cell. We need to remove those and store them in something that's not going to hurt us. So that electron actually attaches to a proton to become hydrogen. That then attaches to the oxygen, and when you add hydrogens and oxygens together, you get water. Water is harmless to us, right? Water's a great thing. Now we've accounted for all of the things in our equation. But notice, oxygen did not have a part to play in anything except for the very end. We say that oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transfer chain. Without it, this whole process would come to a screeching halt. Because without that oxygen, it's too dangerous to run everything in the mitochondria. Because you're just going to build up electrons and it's going to kill the cell. So oxygen is kind of very important, so much to the point that we call this whole process oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative means you got to have the oxygen. Phosphorylation means you're taking ADP and adding a phosphate to it to make ATP. Oxidative phosphorylation. So we've got to have that oxygen. So what are the three big things that occur here? So we have glycolysis, first process. It produces two things, a little bit of energy, ATP, and then our two NADHs. Then we have the citric acid cycle, right? It kind of breaks down the last bit of the pyruvate, releases the rest of the ATP, NADH, and also FADH2s. And the last part is the electron transfer chain, which produces a vast amount of ATP, 34 ATP. Added it all up, about 38 ATP on average. And there's also two molecules to kind of account for. That's our electron carrying molecules, which is our NAD, carries a hydrogen, it's NADH, and our FAD, which carries two hydrogens, so it's FADH2. You're going to see all of this over again in a little bit more detail as we kind of go throughout the notes.